So today my guest is Dr. Vivien Lee, based out of Toronto. She's a psychologist and she is a founder of the Center for Trauma Recovery and Growth. I love the name. Tell us a little bit about how you came up with that practice name and kind of what you do in your clinic.
So in terms of the practice name, I was kind of wrestling with what I wanted to call my practice, and this is my first practice, so I was pretty nervous about it and excited. And because I do specialize in trauma, I thought it would be important to have trauma somewhere in the name, just so people could really see what I focus on. But I have found that the conversation so much of the time focuses on post-traumatic stress disorder, or post-traumatic stress injury, right? And we talk a lot about how people can suffer from, the effects of trauma, especially some of the long-term chronic effects, which are very important for us to talk about. I'm very glad we're talking about it. But, it just concerns me sometimes that I don't hear enough about recovery and even potentially growing from our experiences of trauma. And I certainly have seen that in many of my clients where, you take someone who never thinks they're ever going to get better and they're, in the worst experience of their life, and they slowly work so hard to build back up, and they reach this place of growth, and it's phenomenal to see. And so I wanted something that, obviously talked about trauma, but also how can we move forward from this, right? Rather than getting stuck. Because what does PTSD do a lot of the time? It keeps us stuck in the past or, frozen in our minds in the present.
Right. Awesome. And how long has your clinic been in operation for?
Just since September 2019.
Wow.
Yeah. So
but your work with public safety goes back quite a few years from as I understand it.
Yeah, so during my psychology residency about 10 years ago, I worked in an operational stress injury clinic in London, Ontario. And after residency, I got a job in the psychological trauma program at CAMH. So there at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto. So there we would see people primarily referred through our workers' safety insurance board, WSIB. So we would see people from around the province, and it wasn't just public safety, it was anyone who'd been injured, traumatized in the workplace. So basically you name some kind of trauma or accident and we probably saw someone who was involved. But we saw quite a few public safety, and as the years went on, we saw more and more and more. And I have immense respect for public safety, and not to go off on a tangent, but the reason I was interested in military back in my residency was I'm Korean, but I was born and raised in Canada. I didn't know much about the Korean War, and it wasn't until I visited Korea in 2007, and they have a war memorial cemetery there that the United Nations put together, that I really realized how absolutely different my family's life trajectory would have been, and my life, obviously, if other people hadn't put their safety and health at risk and lives. So it just really got me interested in military and public safety and people putting themselves at risk for the good of the community and for other people. I would hear these stories from public safety over and over in the trauma program, and everyone's experiences are very, very different. But fundamentally, you'd hear the same kind of story, the emotional experience be the same, right? So all this trauma, trying to get through it, doing a really good job for a really long time getting through it, kind of getting, chipped away at, not understanding what on earth is happening. Their family certainly not understanding what's happening. Their peers at that time often weren't understanding what's happening, and they didn't feel like they were receiving support from anywhere. And so it wasn't just the trauma itself and the PTSD and the impact. It was also that feeling of isolation, which just makes everything so much harder, right? Feeling that we're alone in something really makes pretty much any issue so much harder, so much more isolating, making us feel like we're crazy or like we're aliens. And so but for me, it was really important, not just early identification and getting people help early, but that social support, right? Family support, peer support, organizational support, because if we can really get work through this as a community, it doesn't have to get to that point where I've seen so many people at the lowest of the low for a long time. People get that hope and they get that support, and they it just gives them the strength to move through their recovery.
And one thing I'm struck by that I consistently hear from this privileged position of interviewing experts like yourself is how you've weaved in kind of your heritage and your roots into potentially your own approach or outlook in life. And so I'm kind of curious what you see in terms of understanding roots and heritage as an integral part of the healing process, or at least gaining perspective on life. Can you shed some light on that for us?
Um, well, I'm not sure if I'm going to answer your question exactly as you intended it. But I mean, we all have our different life experience. We all have our different history. We all have our different developmental experiences growing up. And of course, that can involve different kinds of belief systems as well. Um, so when I'm meeting with clients, I really try to work through their lens, right? And their lens is going to be shaped by so many things before they ever reach my office. So of course, the culture of their particular workplace. I mean, of course, there's a lot of similarities between, for example, fire services, but of course, each individual service is going to have their own kind of unique culture. So, looking at the lens through their time at the fire service, looking at the lens of, if they're religious or spiritual, what kinds of filters do they see the world? What kinds of strengths do they find in the world? And of course, their family of origins. I've seen actually quite a few public safety personnel, who report histories of abuse or trauma in their childhood. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, that really, really fundamentally, shaped who they became. You see a lot of them wanting to become helpers, right? Because, they weren't helped and they want to be able to help others because they know what it's like. But of course, the intertwined with that, wanting to help is, having difficulty taking care of yourself, because
Yes.
that might not have happened when you were young, and being able to take a step back and say, actually, maybe I need a bit of this support and help too. So it's really factoring in how are they viewing the world. So because I want to be able to work through that lens and that filter
Mm-hmm.
to be able to help them on their own particular journey.
And one thing that I've tried to do the last few years is bridge the gap between public safety and mental health clinicians. And one of the things I consistently find in common is, like you mentioned, this idea of being attracted to a helping profession as kind of an extension of your life experiences. And so can you kind of mention the impact of what, psychologists term adverse childhood experiences, and how that can form or shape, as you call it, filters throughout your life, and perhaps set the groundwork for you to experience trauma in a way that is often potentially rooted in your childhood and early childhood at that.
Yeah, so this is a special passion of mine. So actually going through grad school, my focus was always trauma, but it was actually on childhood and adolescent trauma. So I was
Okay.
looking at the impact of abuse and neglect on one's child development. So of course, it kind of varies on is the abuse and trauma chronic, or is it a one-time incident? Is what stage of development were they at when it happened? Was it by someone they knew versus someone they didn't know? But as people are growing up, obviously we see kids physically developing, but I think we don't really recognize as much how much their brains are developing, right? And in their brains, obviously, are all the connections that help us process emotional interactions or interpersonal interactions, interpreting situations, not just learning math and reading, for example. So, as we grow older, there's all these developmental tasks we have to learn. We have to learn how to regulate our emotions. We have to learn to kind of interact and compromise with, other kids. We have to learn how to navigate interpersonal relationships and, conflict, and then increasing independence as we get older. So you can imagine if someone, for example, has been emotionally neglected. Trauma, I don't think people really recognize enough, because it's not like something that's done to someone, something
Mhm.
that's been omitted and not given to a child. So if you have a child who doesn't really have a lot of that emotional interaction with their parents or other caregivers, they're not really learning what a healthy, social interaction looks like. They're not really learning, okay, if I want to share these toys with Susie, I have to learn to regulate some of my emotions and not hit her over the head with it,
Mhm.
right? Otherwise, Susie's not going to be my friend. So if I'm not having these kind of interactions, I don't learn how to navigate, good friendships and relationships. I'm not learning how to read social situations, and I'm not I'm not allowing not allowing, but I don't get the opportunity to really learn a lot of these interpersonal tasks and emotion regulation tasks that are so important when we grow up. So if I haven't had a lot of those opportunities, and now, I'm in a, let's say, public safety role or a clinician role, I may not recognize when I'm having strong reactions, right? I may not recognize when I'm feeling very anxious about something or very sad about something. I just know I feel screwed up, and I better just, suck it up harder, to get through,
And
because
it's
I
kind
don't
of
have,
like your normal because you're
yeah,
so
it's just,
used to
I don't have the
it.
language for it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And it kind of reminds me of like a tree that gets a spike put into it, and the tree grows around it and the spike stays within it. And yet physically the tree looks normal, but it's only when you were to slice it open that you see that something foreign in it has, been part of the core of it for so long. So I'm kind of curious about the depth of discussion this would take for a member of public safety to get at their core issues. As a therapist, is that something that you've been able to delve in quite a bit with as someone that might be dedicated to ongoing therapy? Because I'm guessing that's a pretty deep level.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's going to be hard to treat trauma without, hearing about all the trauma at some point.
Mm-hmm.
For example, I've been working with, this lovely individual who, growing up, didn't have obviously a great childhood, and who never heard any kind of positive reinforcement, only negative, and, punished quite harshly if expectations weren't met. And so, this individual has been struggling because, there's all this operational stress that happened. And this individual just really beats themselves down over and over and over about, how they should have been stronger and what's wrong with them and why are they crying, because they don't know how to speak to themselves kindly, right? They don't know how to speak to themselves with compassion, or even just like with a nice word here or there. And so you can imagine how that might get in the way of recovery.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I'm constantly beating myself up for not being better, it's going to be hard for me to get better, right? Because I keep kind of beating myself down into the same hole. So we really had to look at, what are the lessons that were transmitted to you growing up? What's the language you use to speak to yourself? Would you ever speak to anyone else like the way you speak to yourself, right? So just being able to show themselves self-compassion and kindness, and challenge some of those thoughts where they feel that they're a piece of garbage or they're very weak, and looking at the evidence for and against those kinds of thoughts. So if we're not addressing those tendencies, we're really not going to get too far in trauma treatment.